Welcome everyone to the IAPP web conference, Leverage Your Compliance Efforts, Preparing for Upcoming State Privacy Laws, sponsored today by Level Up Consulting. My name is Jordan Hardy, Programming and Speaker Specialist here at the IAPP. We'll be getting started with the presentation in just a minute, but before we do, a few program details. Participating in today's web conference will automatically provide IAPP certified privacy professionals who are the name registrants with 1 CPE credit. Others who are listening in can apply for those credits through an easy to use online form on our website. I also want to let you know that a recording of this program will be available in your My IAPP, My Purchases, My Recordings portal within 48 hours. So if you just log into your My IAPP account on our website at the top right, and then go into My Purchases and My Recordings, you'll see it there with the slides as well. Please feel free to post any questions you have for the panelists in the Q&A area at the bottom of the screen at any time. Now onto our program, and I'm excited to turn it over to our former colleague and friend to host the program, Dave Cohen.
Well, thanks very much, Jordan, and it's terrific to be back here on an IAPP webinar. It's really great to be on the platform again with some old colleagues and some new colleagues here. And we're very excited about the program that we're going to be bringing to you today. As Jordan mentioned before, we're going to be doing a review of the recent state privacy law developments. And so let me go ahead and jump forward and introduce our panelists today. Starting off, we'd like to very much welcome Jessica Lee, who is the co-chair of Loeb & Loeb's Privacy Practice Group. In this role, Jessica helps companies market and monetize their digital products and content and advises on everything from interest-based and addressable advertising, data analytics, location-based tracking, smart devices and wearables, to the use of emerging technologies like AI, VR, AR, and facial recognition. Jessica's assisted dozens of organizations design their privacy programs and operationalize US and international privacy and data security requirements, including GDPR, HIPAA, the NIST cybersecurity framework, and more recently, of course, CCPA and CPRA. Jessica has deep experience advising companies in the ad tech, e-commerce, and entertainment space, as well as clients in more heavily regulated sectors such as healthcare and financial services, which is why we're especially happy to have her on the panel today. Welcome, Jessica.
Thanks for having me.
And joining Jessica on the panel today, Eric Dietrich is the Managing Director of the Level Up Consulting Group here, with overall responsibilities for developing and maintaining client relationships, bringing unique service offerings to market, and achieving Level Up strategic goals. Eric's been providing consulting services for nearly 20 years to large and small public and private companies across a broad spectrum of industries. His areas of expertise include privacy, data governance, cybersecurity, risk management. Formerly, Eric oversaw a team of nearly 200 employees providing consulting services focused on privacy, cybersecurity, data governance, and audit. Eric, thanks for making some time to be on the program with us today.
Yeah, appreciate it, Dave.
And to round out our panel today, Jo Devaris joined Booking Holdings as its first head of global privacy in late 2019. In this capacity, she is responsible for building and aligning a consistent privacy program across Booking Holdings' 6 brands, Booking.com, Priceline, Kayak, OpenTable, Agoda, and RentalCars.com. And prior to joining Booking Holdings, Jo was the first global chief privacy officer for Mercer, where she was responsible for developing and overseeing a global privacy program, providing appropriate controls and risk mitigation for the use of data across diverse lines of business. And before Mercer, Jo held several senior leadership positions at American Express. She's a frequent speaker at the IAPP and other industry events, and we're really grateful to have her with us on the panel today. Also a good friend. Welcome, Jo.
Excited to be here.
And with that, let me move forward and share with everybody a quick overview of what the structure of the program is going to look like today. In just a moment, Jessica's going to get us started with an overview of proposed state privacy laws, and we've got some recent news to share with you as well. And then we're going to go into look at the impact that those laws are going to have on businesses and their obligations, the different controls that are going to need to be put into place for businesses to meet those requirements. And then we're going to talk specifically, get down into the practicalities and the nuts and bolts, and talk about how to leverage what are hopefully existing controls toward what are likely to be some of these future privacy obligations. We're going to leave lots of time for your questions. So please, those of you out in the audience, submit your questions, as Jordan mentioned at the top of the program, through the question and answer panel throughout. And we'll either intersperse them or we'll leave some time toward the end for question and answer, dedicated question and answer period. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Jessica and for an overview. And Jessica, it's all yours.
Thanks, Dave. If you want to go to the next slide, we can just take a look. If anyone's following, which if you're on this call, I'm assuming you are, following kind of the horse race around state privacy laws, you know that there's over half of the states in this country are considering some version of a privacy law. Most of these are comprehensive. Some of them are a little bit more targeted or specific, and some states have multiple privacy bills. And this is moving very quickly. So this map from the IAPP, which is great, was updated March 3rd. It's already out of date, right? It's been a week, it's already out of date. We hear that Florida has died. So Florida will not be passing privacy legislation. So anyone concerned about the private right of action there can exhale, at least for this year. But like many of these other laws, the expectation is it'll be back again next year. And we're going to be in this cycle for quite some time, similar to the Washington state law. I can't remember if we're on iteration 3, I believe, maybe, of this privacy bill. Again, does not look like it's going to pass this term. So we'll be back here next year. And those are just 2, right? We still have a lot of blue on this map. And, you know, there are a lot of, it's hard to track because there are a lot of like legislative nuances in each state. Every state has a different kind of timeline or process they have to follow. Sometimes that process is what causes the bill to fail because there's really just not enough time to noodle through some of the details. But if you go to the next slide, instead of kind of going state by state, I think it's a little bit more helpful just to think, you know, conceptually what we're seeing coming out of each state. And a lot of these are similar to what we already know exists, right? We have CCPA, CPRA, we have Colorado and Virginia coming up in 2023. These laws generally give consumers a broad set of rights. It puts, you know, obligations on businesses, but just to kind of drill down maybe into some of the additional themes we're seeing, you know, so first, you know, this limitation on the collection and use specifically of sensitive personal information. You know, we see in Colorado and Virginia, for example, we have now opt-ins for certain uses of sensitive personal information. We're going to continue to see that. We see some more states calling out sensitive personal information in particular, but generally speaking, beyond even sensitive personal information, we're getting both opt-out and opt-ins for targeted advertising. Most of these laws have a specific call out. They're not always like sale like CCPA is, but sometimes they're more specific about targeted advertising and permitting an opt-out, or like I said, an opt-in in some cases. For states that do have sale, similar to CCPA, we're seeing broad definitions of that word. So after all of the hand wringing in 2022 about what is a sale, it's a lot bigger than what probably people hoped it would be, right? And we're seeing things like contextual advertising or non-personal ads exempt. But again, the definition is fairly broad. You know, for consumer rights, you know, these are mostly standard, you know, deletion, right to know / access, opt out. We'll see some rights to correct, for example, and then some states are putting in the concept of portability that comes out of the GDPR. We're seeing more accountability requirements. That's another kind of key theme, is that we saw CCPA, but everything after that has trended somewhat in the direction of GDPR, including things like having more GDPR-like principles, but then also these accountability requirements. So risk assessments, in some cases that's for high risk activities. Sometimes that's more focused for cybersecurity risk. We should be anticipating the need to do some level of risk assessment if we're not doing that already. And then we're also seeing audit requirements. And that's auditing of your vendors. So having a vendor management program in place, and not just sort of like the paper exercise of getting an audit right, but actually being able to demonstrate going through an audit process. And then this last bucket is where I think some people are focused, because you know, these are the kind of first pieces I went through were themes that we see in the existing state laws. But then there are other elements of some of these state bills that are being proposed that I would kind of put in the outlier bucket, right? So for example, New York State, which has not moved recently, and so I'm not really sure the likelihood that that's going to go through, but that includes a fiduciary duty, right? So it makes the business a fiduciary of their consumers' data. That obviously puts an enhanced level of responsibility over how that data is used. We're seeing this concept of a digital tax. So Alaska, I think, has a 3% fee on data disclosure revenues. I don't know if that's going to go through. I think we'll talk about Utah later, but the theme is that some of these outliers are really what's holding up the process of getting some of these bills through. But we shouldn't assume that none of these concepts will make it through. Private right of action, obviously a very sticky topic. That's probably one of the things that held up Florida from going through, was the concept of a private right of action is still in that bill. We're seeing data broker registration, and then algorithmic transparency, which is a theme we're seeing at the state and federal level in terms of being able to, explain to a certain extent algorithms that are making decisions somewhat tied to the GDPR definition of either having legal or significant consequences on an individual. But these are some of the main themes we're seeing coming out of the state laws. So if you go to the next slide, I'll just kind of pull out, I won't spend a ton of time on this, but just some other obligations to see, some more specific requirements around privacy policies, specifically calling for more transparency and readability, in some cases specifically calling out the need to disclose where data is sitting, for example. So that's just one thing we're seeing. I mentioned the cybersecurity audits. We're seeing more restrictions around discrimination. And again, this is a theme we're seeing at both the state and federal level. There's a concern about the intersection of privacy and civil rights and the use of data for discriminatory purposes. And so we're seeing more call outs in that space. I'm sorry, this should be expiring opt-ins, not opt-outs. So similar to, if you know the VPPA, the Video Privacy Protection Act, you have to re-up your opt-in for that law every 2 years. We're seeing similar themes that even if you get an opt-in for something, that opt-in doesn't last forever. So you might have to go back to your consumer and get a new opt-in. Requirements to pass deletion requests. And then again, another topic of a lot of hand-wringing, which is responding to a GPC, a global privacy control. So this would be a theme that we see in California and also in the Colorado bill. But this requirement to respond to browser-based opt-outs, and what does that look like? And so some states are also kind of following the trend of including that as a requirement. So if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about Utah. Utah so far is the first winner we have. I don't know who had Utah on their scorecard, but congratulations if you did. But kind of to what I was saying earlier, Utah is very similar to Virginia's law. There's no private right of action. There's nothing, particularly extraordinary about it. There are updates to privacy notices. We see new data subject rights, but really this tracks existing law. And so for most companies, if you are complying with, or you're preparing to comply for Virginia, you don't need to do anything additional to get ready for Utah. And I should mention, Utah has passed the House and the Senate in Utah, but it's likely to be signed into law by the governor and should go into effect in 2025. So we have more time, but again, this isn't one like the ones that have more outliers that are going to require additional development work or operational work to get ready for. So one positive here. If you go to the next slide. And this is just to show some themes. A lot of these laws, like I said, are falling into these buckets, are either very much CCPA or CPRA-like, or they're very much Virginia or Colorado-like. And that, I think, at least is a good thing for most businesses, because you don't want to be in the situation where playing privacy whack-a-mole and every single bill is completely different and requires a new build. That's just going to, become an operational nightmare. There are going to be things in here that there might be different links that we need to have, right? So it'll be opt out of sale and limit sensitive information, and maybe it'll be opt out of targeted advertising. So we might get into some kind of link nightmares in terms of very prescriptive requirements about what we have to say on a homepage. And we might have, similar to what we saw in other state laws, very specific requirements about what need to go into vendor contracts. And so that's going to require some lift. But for the most part, these are at least kind of shaking out into these kind of big buckets. And then some are really going more towards kind of the GDPR lens. But this at least just gives you a sense, if you're looking to map some of the similarities, how these bills are shaking out.
Jessica?
Yep.
Maybe I'll just ask a quick question here. I'm realizing for those that are fairly new on the line in terms of tracking the development of these state laws, we should probably just touch on the timeline. So most people probably know CCPA is currently in force. Colorado, Virginia, and CPRA are going to become law on January 1st, 2023. Maybe just cover a little bit on the timeline, and then when enforcement might actually happen, just so people understand, and maybe touch on the look back period and how that works and what that is.
Sure. Yeah. So some of these laws have a 1-year look back period. Again, the look back period just means that say you get a request on January 2nd, you would have to pull data from the previous year. My hope for most companies is that is not as scary as it was, again, in 2020 when we were talking about CPRA or CCPA, because ideally you have mapped your data at this point, or at least you have a sense of what you've collected and where it sits. But if you haven't, that's why that look back period is concerning, because you have to kind of do some of the background diligence before that January 1st date because of that look back period. But like you said, we're looking at January 1st, 2023 for a lot of these. The enforcement window is 6 months later. So we're talking about July. It's unclear right now because in California in particular, the regulations have been delayed. So we're not expecting to get, and the regulations like we saw with CCPA will have a material impact on how companies comply with the law. Like there are big questions hanging out there. And I think we're going to expect to see some time, hopefully in Q2, maybe the beginning of Q3, draft regulations and then have them final by Q3, Q4. But it's March and we don't have anything yet. So, and I believe in the last meeting of the CPPA, the agency that's creating and that will be enforcing the CPRA, someone comment requesting that enforcement be delayed in light of this because companies will have to get ready and adjust. And the comment was something to the effect of, we'll take it into consideration or we'll think about it. So no promises that enforcement is going to be delayed just because regulation is going to be delayed. And a lot of bills are set up similarly and with respect to whenever they would go into effect, there might be some delay period with respect to enforcement. I should say just briefly, we're seeing different levels of enforcement. So I did mention there's some that have a private right of action, some have no private right of action or private right of action for breach only. But then we're seeing some that are experimenting with sunset windows and cure period. So you might have a cure period before you could bring a private right of action, or a cure period before regulatory enforcement, or you have a period without private right of action that would sunset and eventually a private right of action would kick in. So I think, it seems like states are trying to figure out what the right balance of enforcement looks like to give their bills some teeth. So we're seeing that range there.
Yeah, we have a quick question from the audience here that I can answer about what we're seeing on the slide here, are these existing laws or proposed laws? To be clear, these are bills that are wending their way through state legislatures and not have not been passed into law yet. So they are pending or proposed is the answer to that question. And then we also have a question here, Jessica, maybe a lot of folks out there in the audience work in the healthcare space, and they're wondering whether there are exceptions included in the scope of, if there's a trend amongst these with regards to carve-outs generally in line with the CCPA PHI exception. Do you want to comment to that?
Yeah, there are a lot, and same for financial data. So for the extent you're covered under HIPAA, or your data is covered under the clinical trial regulations, similar to what we saw with CCPA, or your data is covered under GLBA. If you're, in the financial sector, we're seeing carve-outs. And then some of them go even more in detail beyond kind of those two big buckets, but I imagine those are two of the big popular ones. Right. But all of these laws have some exceptions and carve-outs with an eye to these companies are already complying with kind of a heavy, privacy regime. And so they're not covered by this. But we have to go into each one and look at what those definitions look like, because with all of these things, there are gaps in some cases. So for example, if you're using data outside the scope of HIPAA, right, if it's been de-identified and using it for marketing purposes, that might fall into scope. So we're still going to have to do that kind of state by state analysis once these pass to see how the exceptions impact you.
Terrific.
And then this is, I think we could just leave this for a resource. This is a good kind of overview of the state laws and does, again, some of that mapping of what are the big consumer rights that we're seeing and what are some of the business obligations. And I believe this is linked in the deck. So I would just encourage, if you want to kind of dig in, or if you're sitting in a state that's still blue, the bill is still, alive and possible, you might want to go in and just kind of see where things are trending. I will say, I'm not, no one should be doing anything necessarily for bills that haven't passed into law yet, but it's just kind of as you're going through, particularly this year, and I know Joe and Eric are going to get into the operational aspect of this, but as you kind of go into building out your programs, having an eye to where things are going or the themes will help, I think, set you up for if and when some of these do pass.
Yeah, and Jessica, just to confirm, this is an IAPP resource. It's terrific work by the Weston Research Center over at the IAPP. And there's a slide in the back of this deck, a resource slide that has a link that will take you directly to this chart and to the map and some of the other resources we've mentioned in the slides. Terrific. Well, thanks so much, Jessica. And with that, let's move on to Joe for the potential impact of these state laws on privacy controls and how this kind of works from within a company on the ground in real life. Joe, over to you.
So we can go right to the first slide here. And this is actually the part at the top of that table that Jessica was just alluding to. When we think about the impacts of these future regulations or even the ones that have already passed, breaking them down in terms of what were the rights from a consumer perspective and what are the obligations from a business or corporate perspective, just help you frame the implementation and operational aspects of these regulations. It helps you find the sameness and helps you find the outliers to determine kind of how do you decide what that intersection is from how you're going to operationalize this or provide guidance to your stakeholders in terms of the expectations on how they will operationalize it. But we can go to the next slide in terms of really how you think about the impact of any of these regulations from a state perspective. And what I'm going to speak to here is no different than any other jurisdiction as well. We're focused today on the US, but I would say that some of these considerations that we are talking through in terms of how it impacts your privacy program are no different if we're talking about some other jurisdiction outside of the United States. And we know there's lots that we're tracking outside of the United States as well. And so first I would say that this really, it requires some soul searching from a corporate perspective, right? Now from you as a privacy officer perspective, although you might be questioning your career path with all of this evolving change as well. But from a corporate perspective, you really have to look at what is the framework that you use. And if you haven't decided or picked a framework to rely on, I would encourage picking something as your baseline to at least build your program on top of, and to at least be able to communicate the impacts of these. If you don't commit to some sort of framework, then it really starts to feel unwieldy as each of these regulations change in the United States and like I said, around the world. It will become an impossibility to manage a program, to feel like you can communicate what the impacts are, what the changes are. And also if you are audited either internally or from an external audit or an internal audit perspective, it makes it really hard to explain the impacts and how you're actually advising of those impacts without having some sort of baseline. So I'm not going to encourage which framework is best. I'm just encouraging pick a framework and build upon that. And so depending on the framework that you have chosen, that actually helps you determine kind of what your controls are and your control objectives are. And then you want to think about, just as important as your framework is the reality check. And again, this is a little bit of corporate soul searching. What is your program maturity? Where are you at today? You don't want to necessarily be building impacts for a state that is much more mature than your current state. It will be an impossible task for you to endeavor and meet. That program maturity, where you're at today and where you want to get to maybe by the effective date of these regulations, is an important discussion, an important decision that's bigger than privacy, than you as the privacy professional. It's something you need to talk about, and that's what I mean by risk appetite. It's something you need to discuss with those within your organization that make risk decisions and that own that risk, usually at a senior level perspective. And so it depends on what your governance model is within your organization, who you're going to have these discussions with. But you want to decide and discuss, do we have a conservative approach here, or are we a little bit more comfortable taking some risks here? And from there, that will actually inform your program maturity in its current state, and also the program maturity goals that you have for the effective date of some of these regulations. I would encourage you to decide on the framework and the maturity that you're at today, this year, sooner rather than later, to help you on the implementation planning and the targets for any of these regulations that become effective less than a year from now and then beyond. And then I think all of that, these first 3 bullets help you incredibly in terms of then how you communicate on an ongoing basis. What are the risks? What's the delta or the difference between where you're at today, where people thought you were at today until you did that kind of soul searching and identification and commitment, and where you want to get to tomorrow. And I think it also helps then in your communication as a privacy leader in your organizations from a senior leadership perspective. You can be very transparent and very clear in how you communicate with those that will now own some of this risk or be accountable for some of this risk outside of privacy. And so I think, again, if you haven't done any of this yet, it will be really hard for you to visualize what the impacts are of any of these upcoming regulations or any of these recently passed regulations. But I would encourage you to take the time necessary over the next couple of months to do this so that you can figure out next steps.
Hey, Joe, quick question for you here with regards to that risk appetite and the kind of corporate philosophies there. I was just thinking about for folks on the call that are in privacy offices that are maybe a little less mature and in the growth, foundational and kind of growing and early on stages. And I was just thinking about the difference between a B2B organization or a B2C organization. I would think that B2C organizations, if the program is a little bit less mature, there would be some pretty strong arguments to make to senior leadership with regards to consumer rights and brand reputation and all of that.
Absolutely.
Do you want to speak a little bit about that? Just like,
yeah.
And
So
also
I think, yeah, you're absolutely right from a maturity perspective, right? Or where you want to be, where you are at today, where you want to be tomorrow, where you want to stay. I think it does depend on the industry that you're in, how consumer facing you are. A lot of these regulations are consumer facing, or they all are consumer facing to protect the individual. I would say that doesn't get B2B off the hook because
Right.
in many cases, B2B has a 2C part of it. Where you're the B that you're involved in, right? So if you're the business or the vendor or the service provider providing a service to another business, they have expectations on you to demonstrate how you are digesting and ingesting these regulations too, especially if there's a component for them where they are interfacing with employees or customers. So I wouldn't say that B2B you get off the hook. But I would say that you can decide and anchor your maturity where you are today and stay there. You could feel comfortable anchoring to something less than, fully effective, which is at the other end of the maturity spectrum. You could stay right in the middle or you could stay at ad hoc, but you want to anchor yourself to where you are today and say, that's where we're going to stay. And all of our controls and all of our risks will consistently stay within that maturity level. So the maturity doesn't mean that it's your roadmap. It has to be a roadmap of always maturing. It's just, are you fully grown in the way that you want to be fully grown or not?
Yeah, and maybe important to point out at this point that a lot of these bills and certainly the laws that have passed so far, using the GDPR language of controller and processor, really enhance and expand upon the relationship between those entities, the controller and the processor, and giving the controller, rights to assure that the processors are, processing appropriately and following the guidelines of the contracts, and that there's accountability there. Right?
Yeah, there's direct accountability, not just passed through from the entity that you're providing services to. And the other thing I would say is what's common as well is the fact that you have a documented program and you've made some documented decisions. And that's what I'm talking about here as well, right? So, it can't be all up here in your head or in conversations and discussions you had at some meeting with your leadership team. You really want to document all of these foundational principles that guide your decision-making so that you can point to that if ever needed for, either, knock on wood, a regulator or an inquiry of any type.
Great. Joe, I don't know if you wanted to touch on this one. We got a great question in, and I was actually thinking of it myself. For folks that are working with leadership and trying to get that buy-in and have that corporate philosophy that they can work with on their privacy team, metrics are obviously important and reporting up with those metrics. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that, just in general?
Sure. I mean, I think, again, that goes to where thinking through your maturity and thinking through your framework, what would be the metrics that you would use to report on the health of your privacy program? So there isn't like one set of metrics I can say like, okay, it's the one size fits all for all organizations. It depends again on where your maturity level is, what your risk appetite is, and what they want to hear. I mean, it could be things as like you can come up with KPIs, key performance indicators that for you show that your organization is healthy. Or you could come up with key risk indicators that show like within some threshold, you've now crossed the threshold where you're uncomfortable and the risk committee or the leadership needs to know because you're crossing beyond their comfort level and their risk appetite. And so, common things that people measure are like the number of data subject requests come through. How many of those are consumers? How many of those are employees? If you start tracking that from, let's say today is the first day you're tracking that, what are the trends you start to see a month from now, a year from now in an uptick? And is there something you did to make that uptick is a key risk indicator, right? But the key performance indicator might be that we respond to them always within 20 days, even though the requirement is 30 days.
Right.
And so I think it's really, again, it's answering these kinds of questions from a who do you want to be as a program perspective that help you decide what are the metrics then to measure up that program that you have committed to.
Yeah. And Joe, I might add that from a practical perspective, a lot of the companies we work with really like the model of having an online like steering committee, getting some privacy champions within key departments and having a kind of a collective buy-in to be able to help develop those KPIs or KRIs, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it helps actually in the transparency of expectations on those stakeholders to develop those together, but also to kind of have those partners. And we've been talking a lot recently about just training up those people, having them feel like privacy is an opportunity for them as well. And so investing in them to understand the privacy expectations, not just dumping on them a set of responsibilities, I think is a unique opportunity as well in our space.
Terrific. All right. Do we want to move on here? It's like, yeah.
Yep.
All right, fantastic. Well, Eric, over to you then on how to leverage existing controls for potential new obligations. And I know we've also just touched on a whole lot of issues that you really care a lot about and have a lot of knowledge about too. So pass it over to you, Eric.
Appreciate that, Dave. And I was watching the Q&A a little bit as Joe was speaking. And I think one other question that I'm happy to address is around, what's the appropriate way or what are some considerations for selecting a framework that might work best for your organization, right? And I think it was the end of last year, a survey was sent out pretty broad, and I can't remember exactly who performed the survey, but it mentioned that I think amongst the privacy offices that responded, I believe it was nearly 50% of organizations say they're now starting to align with NIST privacy. The other big leader was kind of GDPR. So probably more international folks that have been, at it for a little bit longer might have originally used the GDPR as that initial baseline for establishing those privacy program principles that you would build your program off of. So I think there's a few factors that we see organizations considering when it's coming time to, as Joe alluded to, the importance of aligning to one of these frameworks, for then you could see the differences and the deltas that come about from these state laws and other international laws being passed. One would be your industry and the regions for which you operate might be a factor into that. Also, how product or service specific you might be. And as Dave and Joe were talking about, that B2B, B2C type of relationship could all be factors in the consideration of which framework. But I think there's just on some surveys, and even from what we see amongst our client base, there's been a real adoption of NIST privacy out there, probably a little bit quicker than any of us would have imagined. But it is pretty good framework from the sense that you're able to layer in the maturity and capabilities of that framework. That'll
Eric,
well.
Yeah, Eric, just another point on NIST too that we've talked about is that for one of your key stakeholders is clearly going to be the IT department. There's no way it's not going to be. And the NIST standards have already been developed for cybersecurity. So a lot of IT departments are already familiar with the cybersecurity framework. And so with the new NIST privacy framework, you're showing them something that they're already familiar with and that maps fairly well. And that can be a big aid toward adoption if you do decide to go down the NIST path.
Yeah, no, great point, Dave. All right, so moving on from that question, jumping into a few of these areas that, from our experiences, especially, last year and definitely into this year as it ramps up with organizations wanting to better understand, how and what might need to be done to further align with the CPRA, Colorado, Virginia, and potentially Utah and others. There's some thought about, okay, what existing program functions, what existing program operations can support and maybe be enhanced and tweaked. So the first one, I think that often comes into play quite often is the consumer rights process. So for all those that have been subject to CCPA and or GDPR, I think there's a lot of opportunity to leverage those processes, further expand and provide additional options for those new expanded or changed rights that exist for those consumers or data subjects. So I think, that's a very natural fit. We have a lot of those conversations with our client on what that tweak or enhancement might be. And more often than none, there's not necessarily significant changes that are occurring to the consumer side or to the data subject side, where it might be a tweak to a form if you have appropriate inbound mechanisms established today, whether it's a web form, either in front or behind a login page, whether it's a call into the call center, whether it's an email to the privacy office, wherever you have those inbound channels established today. It's usually small tweaks at this point. Obviously, when the regulations kind of get finalized here, I think there'll be more clarity on what new buttons, as Jessica mentioned. There might need to be some new buttons, new links created, and that could be addressed. But I think a lot of these changes we see are behind the scenes, the operational aspect, and that could come into play as from a data mapping perspective. Do you have all the systems identified for which might have that type of information, especially with the expanded definition under the CPRA of sensitive personal information? Are we going to know what to do or how to react if one of those new requests come in around sensitive information? Are we going to have the knowledge to act upon that internally? So this comes back to enhancing, refreshing, or going about doing updates to your data maps to make sure that they account for all those elements. And if they do, to kind of refresh on, the appropriate, how that data is being used, where it's being stored, for how long, and all those fun things around retention that we all know create so much excitement for every organization, are ways to kind of leverage existing processes and so forth, but some additional considerations around consumer rights. Now, when it comes to kind of, as we mentioned here, the procedures for those potential dark patterns, I think it's always good every time, whether it's a new regulation triggering it or as you move up the maturity scale in your program operations, to kind of reevaluate that consumer experience. Usually over periods of years, new functionality, new capabilities, new engagement opportunities with your clients occur. And it's always good to kind of reset, take a step back and evaluate that consumer experience. And are we pushing the envelope when it comes to how much are we driving the choice of that consumer or whoever's using our product or capability in a certain direction? And are we pushing it too far now where, hey, there's a shiny button over here on the right. We want you to really click on that shiny button and don't worry about the other button that's really small in the bottom. I know that's the extreme, but I think there's definitely opportunities for organizations to revisit that experience where you are getting some type of consent, you're providing some notice about what's going to be done with the data, or you're giving them different, or you're allowing them to exercise their their consumer rights to really make sure it's meeting that spirit of either the regulation or the industry standards you're trying to align there. And it's I know, Dave, we were just talking about this with some of our clients, kind of just, because it's very easy to get very deep into the nuances of these standards, but sometimes it really helps to kind of step up and run through kind of a consumer use case, a consumer experience, and kind of, understand, okay, if there is sensitive data, personal information being collected, maybe there's a valid business need, but what are we doing with it after, right? So really stepping away for a second, resetting a little bit, and reevaluating the consumer experience often is a very key thing.
Eric, just to jump in there quickly and underscore that, for the uses of sensitive personal information within the organization, thinking about the CPRA and the other bills, I incorporate this as well. Pulling way back, as you mentioned, to the spirit of the law, it has a lot to do with is your organization using that collected sensitive information in a way that would be surprising to the user, and is the organization using it in a way that is different than it was given consent or it was offered over for. So if you kind of keep those basic principles in mind, that can be some good guideposts for staying in compliance with regards to that information.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point there, Dave. Now, moving into privacy assessments, I know Jessica touched on some of the newer obligations or the enhanced obligations potentially of organizations about risk assessments or audits to either evaluate the strength or the privacy risks associated with certain activities. And I know there hopefully will be additional guidance, at least with the CPRA coming out on what that really means. But from a organizational perspective, I think there's kind of two aspects we like to think about privacy assessments. One would be, how mature, how well designed do you have your privacy by design programs kind of embedded within the organization? Are you doing privacy impact assessments to some degree to identify, what those privacy risks are to a new enhanced product or service that your organization's offering? If you have pretty well established, defined, and it's pretty well adapted across the various business units, you're probably doing a pretty good job. And then that gets back into the reporting, the KPIs, the KRIs that Joe was mentioning, and you could leverage some of those PIA, privacy by design principles that haven't been embedded in your program to allow further reporting of those risks or risk acceptance, as we were talking about, that the organization might have in determining what that threshold is. The other aspect of these kind of more of a true, we'll say a risk assessment or a gap analysis, where you're evaluating, the program capabilities, how well the program's operating as a whole or within specific aspects of the program, how quickly are we responding to consumer rights requests, and kind of validating the effectiveness of the program as you have designed it internally, and using the different framework that you might have aligned with, the different maturity categories that you might have established, how well the program's operating against those design elements is another way to evaluate, the effectiveness of the program. And it gives you that comfort that, hey, maybe there's things are working well and being operationalized well, and then maybe there is opportunities for improvement. And I think all those type of activities, whether on the PIA, privacy risk assessment type of things, or these audits, I think it would be fair to say that you're putting yourself in a better position for whatever nuances might come out, especially with the CPRA or other state laws when it comes to performing risk assessments. Now, you might have to tweak and adjust a little bit, but you're probably putting yourself in a much better position than doing nothing and not evaluating these risks and getting your arms around it this year. And then some of these others, I think that the more important one here, well, not more important, but one that continually comes up and continues to be an area of discussion at a lot of our clients is around your third parties. I know there's been, just in general across many industries, the maturing of third-party risk programs or vendor risk programs over the last 5 years has been, has made great strides, where years and years ago, it was really the heavily regulated spaces like financial services and healthcare, where there would be pretty well established and mature third-party risk programs, but now seeing that being, expanded into other industries that maybe wasn't as formalized. Now, I think there's definitely plenty of opportunities to continue to expand third-party risk, as I think historically it's also been a very IT security-driven kind of evaluation. And I think more and more as additional regulations get passed or different standards become adopted, that there's more privacy obligations. There's other considerations around overall risk of these vendors that need to start being evaluated. And then, of course, making sure any provisions that need to flow down to your vendors or service providers and or contractors in some of the new definitions under the CPRA are important areas to look at. And I think most organizations have some program in place. So evaluating that and determining where there's opportunities to enhance and mature those programs to account for some of these additional provisions or requirements that might be needed to align with the CPRA, Colorado, Virginia, and whatever else might come down the pipe. So definitely another area of focus that I think we see a good amount of activity, or at least a good amount of discussions happening around to determine the impact around that.
Hey, Eric, speaking of service provider and contractor, Jessica, I wonder if we might go over to you for a moment to talk about this and with regards to CPRA, because I know that there's these definitions are still not as super clearly defined, and it makes a difference how you categorize your vendors, your third-party vendors. Do you want to speak to that for just a moment?
Specifically to the CPRA definitions?
CPRA definitions, and or whether we're seeing similar language being proposed in the bills. Are they adopting? You mentioned on that one slide where there were similarities to the CCPA, CPRA. So some of the bills are choosing to use similar language, service provider, contractor, and there are different definitions for those. It seems like some of the bills are adopting that language, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so for CPRA adds this additional wrinkle because you have businesses, you have service providers, you have third parties, and then you have contractors, which seems like an unnecessary
number of definitions.
Exactly. And just quickly, like the business is the entity that's covered by the law, right? It's a business that it's a company that meets the statutory thresholds. And then you look to, if you're a service provider, you're acting, it's similar to the processor concept under GDPR, right? You're acting on behalf of the entity. You have restrictions, you can't sell the data, you can't use it for other commercial purposes. They do allow you to use it, in certain cases to improve your business, but you can't combine it with other data and use it across clients, right? So the very specific restrictions and a requirement to put that language into your contracts with those service providers. And if you don't, and you've categorized them that way, the AG will knock on your door and want to see that you papered those relationships. So the contract is really important. That's what I was mentioning earlier. I wish everyone would align on one standard so it didn't send everyone into this like contracting swirl that keeps lawyers employed, but isn't really very efficient. But it kind of is what it is. Third parties are the other companies that are providing services for you, but they might have they haven't agreed to that restriction, right? So they might be able to use data for other purposes. They might be able to combine it and use it across their other clients. And that might not be because you're selling data to them in the way you would think about selling data, but that's because that's how the business works. And we see this a lot in the advertising ad tech space. In order to provide the service, you have to do some combination of consumer data. So that's one issue. Although I have seen in some of the laws, they are giving carve-outs to that for businesses that combine data for fraud detection purposes, just because it's really hard to do fraud detection using a limited single business's set of data. And then that wrinkle in CPRA are for contractors. And the definitions are very similar to third parties, but the distinction seems to be that a contractor is providing a service to you, but not providing a service on your behalf. So it might be like a FedEx, for example. is, has an independent relationship with the consumer, even though they're providing services to you. There are also some data sharing relationships where I've seen contractor become relevant, but that one, I will admit, has a little bit of a question mark over its utility. Primarily what I'm seeing is companies are being put either and categorized as third parties or as service providers, and contractor comes up when things are getting weird. That's how that kind of comes into play. And for other states, I don't know that I've seen the contractor concept come in, but it is this idea of you have the companies that provide services to you and they have significant restrictions on how they're able to use your data. And then you have everyone else, right? So whether you're calling that a processor, a service provider, if you're calling it a third party or a co-controller or a joint controller, that's really the framework that's being set up. And then there's the requirement to have contracts, often in both cases. It's just the language looks different.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think that those terms are relatively well defined now, or do you think that we may see some further clarity or definitions when the regulations are published later this year, for instance, for the CPRA?
I'm hoping we might see something around the contractor distinction, just because that's the one that seems to raise the most questions. Like, when would you put a company into one bucket or the other, and does it actually matter? Does it actually matter that much? So we might see some clarity there.
All right, terrific.
Can I say?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just going to say, before you move off, I just wanted to give one note around the dark pattern functionality, which is, companies should be thinking about this outside of the scope of like the direct entry points that you engage with the consumer, or like your privacy policy, for example, or cookie banners and that kind of thing. Dark patterns are being looked at more broadly. So if you're not already really engaged with your marketing teams, you might see dark patterns come up in that space as well, because outside of just like the distinction between buttons, I've heard concerns about things like confirm shaming, right? Like, oh, you must hate your money because you don't want to like sign up for this offer and get this like cool discount, which is like, we're giving it to you so that we can collect this additional information. And as kind of the screws are tightening on the flows of data, marketing teams are looking for other ways to gather more consumer information, and may, let's call it, unintentionally slip into the dark pattern territory as they try to convince consumers to share more data with them. So I think this is going to become an issue that is really going to require kind of cross-team collaboration to address.
Yeah, terrific. All right. Well, thanks so much for that, Jessica and Joe and Eric, for all of those segments of the presentation. Now is the time. We do have a few minutes left in the hour. So if you're out there in the audience and you have questions, please submit them now through the question and answer panel, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. To start off with, Jessica, I did want to go back to you for a minute because you mentioned sale of information and the definition of sale information. I know there's a lot of confusion around this as well. Would you like to speak to that a little bit, just in terms of how it's laid out in the California law, and perhaps whether that's similar language has been borrowed for some of the other state bills that are being proposed?
Sure. I mean, generally speaking, just the definition of sale for California is sharing data for monetary or other valuable consideration. And it is that other valuable consideration that is the gray area where there are a lot of questions. What is other valuable consideration? I think in practice, in the last 2 years, of what we've seen is that any share, any disclosure, and this probably isn't a very popular opinion, but this is just how it's shaking out, that any disclosure of personal information where the other party is allowed to use it or retain it for their own purposes without restrictions on that use is being considered a sale. And I think, initially when we were going through this process, that, obviously companies are looking to define that term as narrowly as possible. Part of it was the optics. Obviously, no one wants to say they're selling information. And I don't think that sell in this context is like the average English definition of sell, right? Like it's being used much more broadly. But as we've seen reporting come out of the California Attorney General's office about some of their enforcement actions and about how sale has been defined, it is much more broad. And so it's like, if you're not in a service provider relationship with the company, it's much harder to argue that you're not engaging in a sale. There are exceptions, obviously, if the consumers consumer has directed that share of information, then that might not be a sale, but it really is much broader. And I think fortunately now we're a couple of years out And I don't know that anyone has had like outrage from having the do not sell. Like, I don't know anyone's gone out of business for like having the do not sell button. I think the impact has been less than what was initially feared. And so I also think trending in the direction of admitting or becoming more comfortable with the concept that the definition is fairly broad, because that hasn't been as kind of disastrous as what was initially thought. And then in terms of upcoming laws, I think we're seeing, I mean, there's a mix, right? So the states, the bills I kind of put in the CCPA, CPRA bucket do lean on that definition of sell. But we've seen others go more broad. And I think the distinction I would point out between California and maybe Colorado and Virginia, like the mission behind this restriction on sale seems to really be targeted at advertising, right? Like that was, I mean, we hear McTaggart, the guy behind the bill, talk about it. Like that was the industry he was going after. But it still has limitations because it's only selling to a third party, right? It's the disclosure to a third party is what triggers sell, and now share, which is sharing for cross-contextual advertising. In Colorado and Virginia, it's just an opt-out of target advertising, period. It's not about whether or not you share it with a third party. So it's actually taking a more blunt approach in that regard. And so we're seeing kind of a mix of how it's the same problem, but states are trying to come at it in different directions.
Terrific. We don't have a lot of time. We've got a couple of extra great questions here in the queue. This next one I would address to Eric and Joe operationally. It's a terrific question. With respect to responding to DSARs and the specific rights, do you think it's okay to generalize the titles of these rights so they can apply to differing regulations in the user interface? Or do you suggest we have right options specific to each regulation naming convention? I was going to ask something similar myself, which is for companies considering a universal rights program. Like I see the writing on the wall, and more and more states are going to get passed where it's very similar rights for consumers. You know, what factors do I use to consider whether I offer these rights to all my customers, or do I continue to parse out and specifically name the rights for, in a state-by-state manner? I don't know, Eric or Joe, whether you'd like to, Eric, you want to jump in?
I'll give some initial thoughts. Happy to see if Joe or Jessica have any others. I think it's a little bit of a yes and a no answer, in the sense that, you could kind of start streamlining and bringing together the overall consumer rights kind of program, and how you're allowing the consumers to execute those rights. And then I think where there's direct overlap, it would be pretty easy, like a right to delete, a deletion request and so forth. But I think it's a little bit, I would have to say, a wait and see on the nuances when it comes to some unique things, like let's say within the CPRA. As we know, there was some specific requirements, like on the do not sell button, that it had to be, there and couldn't be hidden somewhere, right? So I think always got to keep an eye on, what are those nuances for, the naming convention or the location as additional clarification comes on. But there's absolutely opportunities to synergize a little bit.
Yeah, I would totally agree that there's absolutely opportunity to synergize. I think if we put it if we think about the objective here being the consumer and protecting the consumers, and then if you think about your servicing your customers, there's an intersection there. And so if you think about it from a customer experience perspective, again, I think it would go back to what I was talking about earlier. Who do you want to be? From a consumer experience perspective is the same question I was asking about who do you want to be from a privacy program perspective, right? And so I think you have to decide who do you want to be? What are your technical capabilities, and kind of what maturity are those technical capabilities at, and your user interface at? And the more mature your customer experience, obviously you can create a beautiful center through which they can access all of these rights, and it will be clear to them and clear to a regulator. You don't have to call it the same thing as the regulation, that you're achieving the objectives there. But if you're in the less mature state, it's going to be harder to do that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, unfortunately, we're just about out of time here. We only have a couple minutes left in the hour. We have some more great questions here. In a moment, if you didn't get your questions answered, we're going to put up some contact information. I'd like to encourage you to write to us and let us know what your questions are. We'll hopefully be able to get back to you with some useful information. And before we leave, I wanted to cover a couple more things. As mentioned earlier, we have resources slide put together for you in this presentation. These are live links that take you to some great IAPP resources and some great Logan resources for further study on this topic. So when you get a copy of the slides, and as a reminder, copy of the slides are available through the IAPP, but Level Up is also going to be sending a follow-up email, and we'll send a PDF of the slides and a recording of this program as well if you for further study there. And as I mentioned a moment ago, here's contact information for all of us. Please do write in if we weren't able to cover off on your question. We'd love to hear from you. So contact information is available for all of us here. And our colleague Jordan at the IAPP here has put a link in the chat section for a quick survey. Please help the IAPP out by letting them know how you enjoyed this program. Give them any information you might have about ways that they could improve it moving forward. I'm sure it's great for them to hear from you. And as mentioned at the beginning of the program, if you're an IAPP Certified Privacy Pro, you have your certification with the IAPP. Participating in this program, if you register through the website, will automatically credit you with 1 CPE credit. So they'll just take care of that for you. But additionally, there's a live link here that you can click and you can fill out a very simple to use form on the website and you can receive that credit. And if you're an attorney and you're wondering about CLEs, to the best of my knowledge, the IAPP doesn't pre-certify these programs for CLE credit, but they're often eligible. You'll have to apply to your particular bar and receive information about that. So with that, and lastly, if you want to get in touch with anybody over at the IAPP, there's a link here, live webcon team at IAPP.org. You can send them a note and they will be happy to respond for you. And I'm informed here that it's still true about the CLEs. So that's still the state of play. So one last time, thank you, everybody. Jessica, Joe, Eric, thank you all so much for making some time for us for this conversation today. It was wonderful to have you all with us. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day. And to all of you out in the audience, thanks for joining us as well. Hope to see you on another program in the near future. So with that, we'll take us to a program close. Take care, everybody.